Hartman. I'm going to start with a quick video here. Hopefully this works.
I've been thinking a lot about the unimaginable
That's all weird.
situations families in Afghanistan and Syria.
Shush. Best quality ever, it says. Alright. So, most of you will recognize that tune. And I'm sure your friends and family would too. A couple years ago, I bought a Beatles CD and played it in my car to and from school every single day, which blossomed into the obsession that I have today. The Beatles are not only the most known and influential band of all time, but they have continued to inspire generations even after their disbandment. So I'm going to start by talking with a brief history of the band, and then why their influences on other artists as well as the music industry, and then why they continue to be relevant today. There is lots of history, so bear with me. This is a brief summary. I have a lot more that I could have said. They formed in Liverpool, England, 1960. 4 members, including John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. There's the 4 of them. Immediately they could connect with audiences and had a very positive energy while performing. As they started releasing singles in 1962, they became huge hits in the UK, and their debut LP, Please Please Me, reached the top of the chart for 30 weeks before being replaced by their next album. And by the way, all of the red songs are #1 hits, so you'll see those throughout the slide. This started a phenomenon known as Beatlemania, which is mostly associated with screaming teenage girls following them everywhere. They weren't huge hits in the US until they released I Want to Hold Your Hand, which became their first big US hit. In February 9th, 1964, they performed on the Ed Sullivan Show for 73 million people. I'm sure a lot of your grandparents saw that. It was huge at the time. As they were on tour, they met Bob Dylan, who introduced them to cannabis. Whoops. And they also got pretty big into LSD. The Queen actually ignited them, and they were added to the British Empire in 1965. They played one of their biggest concerts at Shea Stadium for 55,600 people, one of the biggest pop concerts ever. Eventually, they did get tired of touring, and they decided to leave with the Revolver Tour in 1966. The following album, this one right here, is widely known as a masterpiece, and a lot of critics consider it the best album of all time. And it pushed pop music forward in huge directions. So they decided to become a studio band and spent 700 hours in the studio working on their most experimental album yet. That was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is a mouthful, but is also widely regarded as one of the best albums of all time. And they performed All You Need Is Love on the first ever live global television program to 350 million people. That is twice the size of the US at the time, for reference. In August of '67, their manager, Brian Epstein, died of a drug overdose. This is regarded as the tipping point and what eventually led to their downfall. John Lennon started using more damaging drugs like heroin, and he left his wife for the young Japanese artist Yoko Ono. She was constantly by his side during recording sessions, which caused a lot of tension in the band. Let's see. They frequently got annoyed with each other while in the studio because they all had different ideas. And McCartney convinced them to start touring again, but those rehearsals didn't really go well. So they ended up doing just one more concert on the roof of Abbey Road in January 30th, 1969. Let's see. As they continued recording, they drifted further and further apart, and Lennon actually quit the band on September 20th, 1969. A week later, Abbey Road released one of their most famous records, as one of the most famous covers of all time. And it was still a huge success, even though the other three didn't really see each other, formally announcing their breakup on April 10th, 1970. And the aftermath: on December 8th, 1980, an insane fan murdered John Lennon outside his apartment building. And 2 decades later, George Harrison died of lung cancer in 2001. The other two members still release music to this day and even play together sometimes, even though they're in their 80s. So once we've started, now we've talked about the history of the band, we're going to talk about why they were so influential. They had great relationships with other artists, one of them being the Beach Boys. They kind of had a rivalry in the 60s. Their sixth album, Rubber Soul, was a big influence for the Beach Boys and led them to create the album Pet Sounds, which is also a very, very good album. There's also there's Beach Boys influence on the Beatles track Back to the USSR. If you listen to it, you'll know what I mean. There's also a lot of notable Beatles covers out there. In fact, the song Yesterday, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, is the most covered song of all time. And there's a couple of other notable covers from bands and solo artists. They also had a huge influence on the music industry itself. They're largely attributed to the success of Capitol Records, which was usually not very welcoming of up-and-coming artists, but since the Beatles came, they were a lot more. And when they visited India in 1968, they became very interested in other cultures and started adding different instruments into their music, especially George Harrison. That's him with the sitar right there. Let's see. So why are they still relevant years afterwards? Unfortunately, we haven't gotten new songs since 1970 because that's when they broke up. But there have been successful compilations of the Beatles, including the Red and Blue albums, which just separate their years into 2 separate parts. And then one, which is a compilation of every #1 hit in the UK and US. Let's see. And then in 1994, Yoko gave Paul some old recordings that John had made before he died. So they started re-recording those and released them in the anthology project as Free as a Bird and Real Love in the 90s. So new Beatles tracks. And then there was one called Now and Then, which some of you may have heard of. It just came out. It was too distorted at the time, so they couldn't figure out how to make it work. But with today's technology, they were able to put in John's vocals and George's guitar bits from the 90s and fully finish it as a Beatles song. And here's a quick list of, I think, some notable Beatles songs. If any of these aren't familiar to you, I highly recommend checking them out. And yeah, that's all I got. Thanks.